High-level talks between China and the United States. What can we expect and what will it mean for relations between the two major powers? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu and this is The Heat. Senior diplomats from China and the United States are in Anchorage, Alaska for highly anticipated talks, the first face-to-face discussions since the Biden administration took office. The dialogue comes after a major downturn in relations over the last few years. There are several key areas to address between the world's two largest economies. For the very latest, we begin now with CGTN's Mark New. He's in Anchorage, Alaska. And Mark, the delegation sat down for their first round of talks earlier. What can you tell us?
That's right, Anand. The meeting got off to a start at 1 p.m. and went for about 2 hours. The schedule should be that they are on break at the moment and then headed back at 7 p.m. for another 2 hours of discussions. Also, they are expected to resume talks tomorrow morning. Now, on the Chinese side, they're represented by Yang Jiechi, the senior diplomat and Politburo member, also Foreign Minister Wang Yi. On the U.S. side, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as well as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Another seen entering was Kurt Campbell, the chairman of the Asia Group and the former NSC Asia Director. Other notable negotiators on the U.S. team include Sung Kim, who helped organize the 2018 Singapore summit between President Donald Trump and DPRK leader Kim Jong-un. That's an indication that DPRK will be on the U.S. agenda. The U.S. also expected to raise issues of cybersecurity, China's action in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea security issues. China has already said there will be no room for movement on those issues. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian had called the U.S.'s attempts at agenda setting a fool's errand that would serve no purpose. China is expected to raise issues of economic security, the trade war in particular, and technology. Technology is likely to be a hot-button issue, especially in light of the Biden administration having labeled 5 Chinese companies, including Huawei and ZTE, as national security threats, something the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson has said will harm U.S. companies too. And within the past day, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission announced it had begun efforts to revoke authorization for Chinese telecom operators, including China Unicom and ComNet, to provide U.S. telecommunications services. Finally, there's the issue of climate change, with China and the U.S. Number 1 and number 2 in carbon emitters in the world. There's certainly much to be discussed on their timelines to become carbon neutral, China's target being 2060 and the U.S.'s being 2050. So plenty of issues to discuss. We'll have to see how they manage to bridge the gap that divides them, has led to more difficult relations at this time. Anand.
Thanks, Mark. That's CGTN's Mark New reporting from Anchorage in Alaska. Well, we have a great panel to discuss all of that. They will be with us in a few minutes. But first, we begin with the former U.S. ambassador to China, Gary Locke, who I spoke to earlier. Ambassador, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
Ambassador, after the difficulties in the China-U.S. relationship over the past few years, how significant is this Alaska meeting? Could it be a fresh start?
Well, I think it's a necessary start of the new Biden administration. Obviously, there are serious issues between our two countries, and it's important to have face-to-face meetings, certainly with the new Biden team, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, for the United States to firmly and clearly articulate their concerns about the relationship and potential ways in which the relationship can be improved.
The Biden administration is downplaying expectations for this meeting, but on the Chinese side, we're hearing China referring to it as a, quote, high-level strategic dialogue and its hopes for a constructive and rational dialogue. What are your expectations? What can be accomplished?
Well, it's very, very important that the two sides, because it's the most important bilateral relationship in the world today, and so much of the world is depending on a strong and constructive U.S.-China relationship. And so it's important that the two sides meet. I think both sides are not expecting any major breakthroughs, but simply to have those face-to-face meetings, to have very frank discussions about the many issues that are separating the two countries, but also to talk about areas of potential cooperation, whether it's fighting climate change, putting pressure on North Korea to stop developing its nuclear weapon arsenal, and also to stop terrorism around the world.
But given their differences, Ambassador, what do you see as some of the biggest and most urgent issues that need to be addressed? I mean, could we see some kind of progress on the trade issue, for instance?
I would not expect any progress on the trade issues. This is really an opportunity, a first opportunity for the two sides to really get together. You have the most senior Chinese officials, Yang Jiechi, Wang Yi, representing the Chinese side, and the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor representing America. And this will be their really first face-to-face meetings, and to really talk about the very serious and deep, very complex issues between the United States and China. But it's important to have that dialogue as the first step.
There are, of course, some very sensitive issues like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang. In fact, the Chinese ambassador to the United States was asked about those issues this week and asked whether China will compromise on these issues. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
I believe that the prerequisite for dialogue and communication between any countries is that both sides should have the spirit of equality and mutual respect. The several issues you mentioned just now involve China's national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity. With regard to these core interests, China has no room for compromise and concessions. This is also the attitude we will make clear in this meeting. If they think China will compromise and give in under the pressure of other countries, or China wants to pursue the so-called result of this dialogue by accepting any unilateral request, I think they should give up this illusion, as this attitude will only lead the dialogue to a dead end.
Ambassador, this week the United States announced new sanctions on officials, Chinese officials, over Hong Kong. Is there a risk that the United States could push too hard on issues that China considers its internal domestic affairs?
Well, the United States has a host of values in terms of freedom of the press and human rights. Human rights is part of the Chinese Constitution, and these are universal values. And so it is fair and proper and legitimate for the United States to press on these universal issues and values that even China says it subscribes to. But it's very, very important that the United States be very clear and open about its views on all of these issues. That's the only way you can have a constructive dialogue and a constructive relationship. You need to be very honest and very frank with each other. China, of course, has its viewpoints, and it will forcefully and strongly articulate its views to the United States, but so must the United States articulate its views to China. That's the only way you can have a healthy relationship in which people, both sides, understand each other's positions. You may not agree with each other, but it's important to get these issues out on the table.
But listening to some of the language and the tone coming from the United States in the run-up to these meetings that are going to be taking place in Alaska, one gets the impression that the United States believes that it holds all the cards in this relationship. As we heard the Chinese ambassador say, if the U.S. thinks China will compromise and give in under pressure of other countries, or by China being forced to accept any unilateral request, then that will lead the dialogue to a dead end. Tough words, but does the ambassador have a point? Does the United States need to go into this dialogue, into these meetings, in a spirit of compromise?
Well, it's not a matter of compromise. It's simply a matter of expressing your views and your values. The Chinese will indicate what is important to them in this relationship. The United States will do the same. That's fair on both sides.
The anti-China policy, which was pursued by the Trump administration over the last 4 years, it gained a lot of traction here in the United States. Will President Biden politically be compelled to continue those policies or even double down on them?
I think you'll see from the Biden administration, with respect to all of its foreign policy, with respect to China and all other countries, a more nuanced, a more surgical, a more, I think, rational and set of policies that really look at the facts instead of trying to have sweeping judgments about any country, whether it's in Latin America or Europe or in Asia. The Biden administration is going to look at every single issue on its own merits and not treat, for instance, any country as somehow bad and all the people from that particular country bad, whether it's from Africa or from China.
You talked earlier on about areas of cooperation between the two countries. I mean, these two countries have already cooperated on issues like climate change, medical research, especially now in this time of the pandemic, international security, especially on the Iran nuclear deal. Can both sides work together? Do you see some progress on these issues?
Well, there's more to be done on all of these issues, whether it's climate change, finding a cure for cancer, or developing medicines against the new, tougher strains of tuberculosis, to obviously peacekeeping efforts all around the world. And there has been great cooperation in the past. A lot of that was halted under the Trump administration, but there's really no need why, even though we have our differences, that we cannot work together on issues of mutual concern and, of course, of great importance to the entire world.
These are, of course, bilateral meetings between the United States and China, but the world will be watching this closely as well. How important are these meetings for the larger international community?
Well, the U.S.-China relationship is perhaps the most important two-country relationship in the world today. You know, so many of the problems facing the world cannot be solved by the United States alone, nor can they be solved by China alone. And so the world is looking for leadership and partnership between both the United States and China, working together to address some of these worldwide issues. And so that's why this meeting is very, very important. The United States needs to clearly set out its values, its concerns about China's policies and practices, from trade to human rights. China will, of course, indicate what their key concerns are, and of course they will reiterate that their sovereignty and their domestic issues are not open for negotiation. But those are the viewpoints that both sides need to express, and from that dialogue have a clearer understanding of each other's positions, and then hope that there are ways in which we can respect those differences, manage those differences, but at the same time try to find solutions to some of these issues that are separating the two countries.
There are, of course, many differences between the two countries, but there are also positive relations. There's a history of positive relations between China and the United States, especially when you look at the leadership in each country. Mao Zedong, for instance, and Richard Nixon, for one. Then we had Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter. And the current president, Joe Biden, he's had a close relationship with President Xi Jinping that goes back many, many years. Would you like to perhaps see a meeting between the two leaders take place in the near future?
Well, that's up to the two countries, and certainly President Biden has a lot that he's working on right now, trying to contain the coronavirus, as well as distributing the vaccines and increasing the availability of vaccines for not just the American people, but eventually people around the world. And so he's trying to get people back to work. So. And get our economy going again. So he's got a lot on his plate, but I'm sure at some point the two leaders will meet, and that will be very, very beneficial in terms of the relationships between the United States and China, but also for the entire world.
Ambassador Gary Locke, thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Let's bring in our panel right now. Joining us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a political and economic affairs commentator. Also with us right here in Washington, D.C. is James Moore. He is the CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society, and he's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Trade Development. And with us too from Portland, Oregon is Liang. She is a professor of economics at Willamette University. thank you, everyone, for being with us. Anna Tangle, let me start with you. What are you expecting to come out of these meetings? Do you expect anything substantive? Because, as we just heard, some of these differences run very deep.
No, I don't really expect much, and given Gary's position that the world is looking for a partnership, but the U.S. is not willing to do anything except air grievances, I don't think the problem here is China knowing what the U.S. position is. I think Biden has expressed it quite clearly. He's simply picking up where Donald Trump left off. The difference is he's instead of trying to be a bully by himself, he's trying to assemble a group of like-minded countries who can help him push China into what he believes it should be. Donald Trump brought us a post-truth world. I think Biden has ushered in a post-hypocrisy world. And I say that because you start looking at the individual issues. Taiwan mainland China is criticized all the time for its insistence on the South China Sea boundaries. Taiwan has the same ones, except the U.S. is selling it very sensitive military equipment. If you look at India, India has Kashmir. There's been no mention of that. You had Kurt Campbell saying that China needs to lighten up economically on Australia. That's kind of rich coming from a country that is continuing to put tariffs that were, in essence, thrust into the stage unilaterally by Donald Trump. So, I mean, it's very, very hard. There are many more inconsistencies that go on there. And with these staring people in the face, not only between these two countries, but also the countries sitting on the sideline trying to decide and decipher what is going to happen next.
James Moore, what do you make of it? This is a very new U.S. team, of course. They've been in office for under 2 months. How different will it be from the Trump approach, or will Secretary Blinken and the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan stick pretty much to what's already there, the Trump script?
Well, first of all, I think it is a mistake to believe that somehow there is a mind meld here in terms of what both sides want to come out of these meetings. I think something that has got to be underscored in an important way, and that is the fact that President Biden has been dealing with his Chinese issue for a very long time. When he was first elected to the United States Senate and would ultimately become chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, it was 1973. And the head of China at that time was Mao Zedong. Then came Zhou Enlai, then Deng Xiaoping. He has been very much involved in understanding the evolution of China more than any president who has certainly come to power since World War II. And so we have somebody who's very sophisticated and has brought in a Secretary of State and a National Security Advisor who are in Anchorage right now, who are also very sophisticated in their understanding, nuance, and the history of both of our countries. It's rather extraordinary, but since 2011, as an example, we have had an imbalance of trade between our two countries by 300 billion plus. And we have dealt with that. And now we're dealing with a new relationship that is not really going to begin with this meeting in terms of trying to lay out strategy as much as simply trying to be able to get stock of one another. Let me just mention one other thing. I'm very proud of the fact that the Washington Institute is the private sector partner to 2 congressionally chartered commissions, bipartisan commissions. One on artificial intelligence, one on cybersecurity. The one common thread that weaves throughout the reports that have been coming out of both of these, and that is the question of China. Trying to figure out exactly what we have, how we're going to approach it in the future, and what the outcome could ultimately be.
Liang, we heard there from the former United States ambassador to China, Gary Locke. When I asked him about whether he thinks there would be much in the way of a change in trade policy, he said no, he doesn't think there'd be much in the way of a change. And we know that Donald Trump precipitated a trade war with the Chinese. What's the consequences if this continues?
Well, I think I agree with the previous two speakers. I think this meeting probably will not have any breakthroughs on all those practical matters. I think it's more of a venue where both sides will clarify their positions and maybe air some grievances towards each other. So I don't think they're going to be rushed to talk about trade, even though I think China would like to bring up the issues and try to have a constructive sort of agreement or whatnot on these trade issues. But I think, from Biden's point of view, for one, there is big political bipartisan, support, and also according to the most recent Gallup poll, 54% of the interviewees think that China is the largest enemy, economic enemies of the United States, which is a whopping 23 percentage points increase from the same time last year. So I think it would be difficult at this point for Biden to really do anything substantive and meaningful to this trade tension. However, I do think that this trade war is very, harmful for the United States. As we all understand, this has cost U.S. the 300,000 jobs, and it has caused, somewhere between 0.3 and 0.7% of the real GDP, which translates to over $300 billion by the end of last year. So I think if Biden really, as his team claims, wants to have a foreign policy that's helpful, for American working class, then I think they really need to seriously consider, quickly and constructively engage China with trade and remove those punitive tariffs.
Anna Tangen, the United States wants to pressure China on issues like Hong Kong, Taiwan, as you mentioned, Xinjiang as well. It has already put pressure on China by imposing sanctions on officials over Hong Kong. How will China respond to this?
Well, China's unfortunately reacting in a kind of tit for tat, which I don't think is the right way. I think it should take a higher tone on this. The U.S. Seems to constantly want to needle China, especially before these kinds of summits. And it's not constructive. If the goal is, as Gary Locke said, to assure the world that the two greatest powers who have to cooperate on everything from climate change to the economics of recovering from COVID, I don't understand how listing a bunch of grievances. I also want to take a little issue with my colleague. Kurt, you mentioned that the administration is very steeped in knowledge and experience, and then on the other hand, you say they're trying to figure it out through these studies. I didn't hear anything about what the real strategy is going to be here, other than keeping the U.S. hegemony, which you might say is an end in itself. But I don't think that it's very constructive to say that the world has to bend to the will of one country.
James, go ahead.
Honestly, I think that's a bit tough to lay out. I think the coronavirus pandemic over the past year has given the United States the opportunity to sit back and to really consider where we are and where we're going. The whole issue, for example, of supply chains has come into question in a much more dramatic way than we ever saw before. And the United States, certainly when I served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce and was heavily involved in the relationship between the economic relationship between the United States and China, believed that if somehow the world could be interconnected even more, that it would help establish peace and understanding, because everybody understood that they depended on one another. We've come out of this coronavirus, or we're in the middle of it right now, recognizing that we really do need, certainly here in the United States, to be able to depend on a truly reliable source when it comes to the supply chain in dealing everything from medications, in the case of the coronavirus, to technology in all its forms.
James, there is something else. There appears to be a fundamental difference between these two countries, these two sides. China sees the United States as a partner, someone they can do business with, someone they can resolve international problems with. But the United States sees China as a competitor, as a rival. Joe Biden said so himself. And there is a pretty healthy view in China and in other parts of the world that what the United States is trying to do here is to contain China's development, to contain China's progress. Do the two sides have to overcome that first?
No question. There has to be, there must be a basis for understanding what the common elements are between both our countries. When I first met with one of the first delegations, trade delegations ever to come from China to the United States, headed up at that time by the mayor of Shanghai, the relationship was such that we had a $5 billion exports and $5 billion imports, and the United States actually was ahead by about $5 million. Today, we're in a situation where, as I was mentioning earlier, we have a huge deficit with the Chinese. Clearly, China has been on the move, and the United States has been watching that and is trying to deal with that. The notion that the United States wants to simply be in a position, a hegemonic position, to be able to call all the shots worldwide, I think is an unfair characterization. So what we're doing right now, I think, is looking eyeball to eyeball, trying to begin to understand where we're coming from, recognizing that at least for the new administration, which everybody certainly in China is trying to figure out, these are some old-timers who have experience and understanding about China.
Okay, Liang, there is still much concern in the United States about China's advances in technology, and I'm wondering, could U.S. resistance to China's economic progress be a stumbling block?
Absolutely. I think the biggest flaw, I think, of the U.S. thinking right now is this zero-sum game. This idea that if China rises, that means the U.S. would inevitably fall. And I don't think that's really the way things work. I think, some constructive competition is a good thing. So like you just mentioned, the U.S. sees China as a competitor, but competitor doesn't have to be adversary. I think the United States now, at least according to the Biden's team, they are trying to compete with China from a position of strength. So if they really, walk the talk, meaning that they really invest in their own economy, for example, Washington is projected to invest $6 billion by the end of this year in AI. So I think if the U.S. and China really are, investing in their own economies and have these healthy competitions with each other, I think this will be beneficial for both countries and for the rest of the world. Okay. So competition doesn't have to be destructive.
Right. Anna Tangman, very quickly, I've got 30 seconds. Do you think these two sides can talk to each other as equals? Will the United States accept that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, Kurt going on about eyeball to eyeball without putting any kind of substance to it doesn't make any kind of sense. This has to be a strategic dialogue talking about respect for each other's countries and different values and accomplishments. China has been going forward for the last 40 years, as Kurt pointed out. The U.S. has been going sideways.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks again for being with us.